Okay, so I'm Michael Harrington. I'm president of the Airline Association in Brussels, AIRE, affectionately known as AIRE. It's Airlines International Representation in Europe, which is one of the two main airline associations. We are 55 years old this year, which is a great achievement. And I have been all my life, as you know, Alitalia, but then I created Albastar Airlines in Spain, which is particularly well known for flying passengers with disabilities. So I'm a particular expert in the field of disabilities. But I'm here, Kostas asked me to come and tell you a little bit of what we do in Brussels and where we are today in Brussels. Of course, you all come from a very wide, different backgrounds and different industries. So I can go on about the new ground services handling directive. I can go on about various things, but what I do want to do is I want to tell you what's changed in Brussels. I mean, the new parliament is really a very different animal than the previous parliaments. I was very, very happy to see that the new commissioner is not just for transport but also for tourism. It sounds a very small change, but actually it's a very, very big change. Commissioner Tzitzikostas is Greek, and he is extremely courageous person. He's managed to do more as a commissioner than most of the previous commissioners have done together, and I'll go on about passenger rights in a minute. And also we have the privilege to have another Greek, lovely lady, very capable, Lisa Vosenberg, who is the chairman of the Parliament, the EU Parliament Transport Committee. These two are our principal, call it, players in a certain sense, but as an airline association, we're not just airlines, by the way. We also have associates like Airbus. We have the biggest US dollar hedging company in the world, Corpay, as well as associates. So we also have let's say a strategy to serve the associates with very key intelligence information from Brussels. But Commissioner Tzitzikostas has driven forward a number of initiatives which are very, very difficult. When you imagine that passenger rights, EC261, was created in 2004, and it was never designed as a regulation for passenger delays. It was designed to cut out two, call it, malpractices in the airline industry, one being overbooking and one being cancellation. So since 2004, the airline industry has suffered because the European Court of Justice has assimilated a 3-hour delay to a cancellation. But there's been no rules around it. So for example, there's no list of reasons that would constitute an extraordinary circumstance. There are plenty of individual judgments. It's extremely complicated for airlines to follow. And it's taken 22 years for a commissioner to drive this through. And that, I think, is a fantastic achievement. It's something that not just the airline industry, but particularly our clients, the passengers, have been suffering like you cannot imagine for 22 years because of all of this lack of regulation, put it this way. And above all, one thing that very few people realize is that it has absolutely collapsed the legal systems in many countries, particularly like Germany and Italy. They cannot handle the volume of cases. So it's been a problem, like a wound that has been festering for 22 years. And finally, we have somebody that has driven it through. Unfortunately, behind this very good news, there is some very disappointing news, and that is that the process in Brussels is that the European Commission, who are real experts in various different materials, the European Commission have been working years and years, fighting and fighting, and in 2013, nearly 10 years after the original regulation, they managed to get an updating of EC 261 through the Parliament, and this had was a balanced approach. It had a lot of very, very good things for the passengers, but above all, it also had some concessions for the airlines, which would be able to use this to finance everything that was being asked for by the Commission. Principally, the fact that the 3-hour threshold for delay would be moved to 5 hours. And this would cut down the number of cases and cut down the number of the amount of billions of euros that have been spent in passenger compensation. Unfortunately, the European Commission, working with us as airline associations, they put forward a conclusion to many years of expert work in November 2023, and since then the matter has passed on to the Parliament and the Council. And what hasn't been said here is that the Parliament has very much driven the process, usually before it was with the Council, but Council have made some modifications, some good, some not so good for airlines, but anyway, the Council made a balanced proposal to the Parliament, and the Parliament just said, no, we want this, we want this, we want this. And what I find is very disappointing is that when so much money, when so much expertise for so many years with the European Commission is presented to the Parliament, hardly any of their conclusions have been adopted in this new regulation, which, by the way, will be voted next week to become law. It will take 1 or 2 years for the member states to ratify before it actually hits the ground in Europe. But there are some ridiculous things that are being voted. I mean, the whole rationale behind passenger rights is that if something happens which is within the control of the airline, or within control of the airline sphere, let's say the handling agent or whatever, then if they could have prevented it, if they could have planned for it, then of course it is not an extraordinary circumstance. But you cannot possibly say that a bird strike is something that an airline can control. And when now in the new regulation a bird strike is considered not an extraordinary circumstance, it's something which one says, well, what logic is behind all of this? So I'm very, very pleased that Commissioner Siscotta has managed to finally, after many, many years, break down the system in Brussels to push this through. But what has actually been pushed through is very, very disappointing. And it's disappointing for another reason. Many people think that airlines are completely against passenger rights. Airlines have been fighting for passenger rights for many, many years. It's a complete misperception. And I was very pleased to hear about this issue of the press with Dubai and other things, because the press have been ruining this industry. The press have been saying that we will be running out of fuel. I mean, 1 or 2 airports in Europe do get short of fuel. That happens every year. There hasn't been anything exceptional that's happened this year, which would create this hysteria to say, my goodness, don't book on holidays, don't come to Skiathos, because there won't be any fuel. And instead, this has been, the press has continued to let's say, be very polemic on this, I think is the right word, but they're not accountable. Nobody afterwards says to the press, well, you've caused so many millions of tourists not to come to the destination, or that you've caused them to pay a lot more, because in the airline industry, the bookings that we've been receiving have been far more last minute this year than they have ever been. But the press is not accountable for that. The press will never pay a price for all of the rubbish that they have been, let's say, social media, by the way, in the press, not just the press. So this feeling that we've managed to achieve something, unfortunately, is a bit of a hollow victory, because of when you actually read what is being proposed, it's very, very far from what the experts have presented. The second thing I'd like to talk about is the over-regulation that we have in this industry, because you know that all airlines, thank goodness, thanks to the EU, we have EASA, we have a common licensing system, we have a common safety system. Every single country has certain minimum standard to grant an AOC. Yet, if my Spanish airline wants to lease an aircraft from Lufthansa, it cannot, even if we are licensed under the same EASA system, because we have to ask our authority before for permission to wet lease an EU aircraft. And what does that mean for the passenger? It means that if an airplane would be available to counter a delay, or at least minimize a delay, maybe it would still be over 3 hours, but it wouldn't be 24-hour delay. We cannot, because our authority on a Saturday and a Sunday, firstly, is closed, and secondly, when our authority needs to approve such a request, they don't just say, oh, it's Lufthansa, it's not a problem. They want to know every specific aircraft, every specific maintenance program of that specific aircraft, and then you have to have the aircraft approved, not just the carrier approved. And that bureaucracy that goes behind it is actually very, very detrimental, not just to airlines to minimize delays, but also to the passengers who have to suffer the delays. And there was a key word, my friend Mohammed was very, very astute when he was talking about we need to put ourselves in the position of the passengers. There is a word that I use a lot in my field of disabilities, and that is empathy. Put yourself in somebody else's shoes. The empathy in our industry. Empathy is not taught. It should be taught. With disabilities it is taught, the cabin crew and things. But empathy is something that we should use a lot more. And what I found very disappointing about this latest proposed passenger rights, there is a big political bonus for saying, oh no, we've done everything for the passenger, everything is going to be good for the passenger, etc., etc. Fine, but where is the empathy and the industrial logic to say who is going to pay for this? Because in the end, the person who pays is the passenger. There is no other person that is going to pay for all of these passenger rights. And don't get me wrong, a lot of these passenger rights, they're 22 years late. They should have been here 22 years ago. So we're very, very happy that certain passenger rights are being proposed. It makes our life a lot simpler as an airline manager. But what is completely missing here is saying, well, how are we going to pay for it? Can we cut down the number of cases? Can we make the regulation more simple? So where we are today and where we need to be, unfortunately, is very far apart. I just close with my other subject, because AIRE is on the Climate Expert Change Committee of the DG Klima of the European Commission. We're also, by the way, on the Stakeholder Advisory Board of EASA. But I'm on the Climate Change Committee, and we've been doing a lot of work with Airbus recently. Airbus is an associate member of AIRE, on how a manufacturer can help change the environment. Not only do we have ETS, where airlines are paying, where airline passengers are paying for CO2 which is being produced, but we have CORSIA coming in now, which will affect European and non-European airlines. And we also have a big project that the Commission has worked on for non-CO2. They've created or consultants to the Commission have created a monster computer model, 600 parameters, which is completely unnecessary, and version 3 is not even working yet. And we've been 2 years waiting for this computer model. For what? To measure non-CO2, when taking an approach to say, well, CO2, non-CO2 could be 10% of CO2, just very simply. But instead they've gone and spent millions on this computer model, and yet we're yet to see it working. But the real scandal here is the regulation. The ETS regulation means that the passengers have to pay a carbon tax. And until very recently, when the new refuel regulation came out, we have had over a decade of airlines paying over 10 billion euros in carbon taxes, huge amounts of money. Well, passengers paying for with the airline. And this money has not been, and it was never in the regulation, so this money has gone into the member states' budget, and it has not been used for environmental purposes. This is an unbelievable scandal. When the new refuel regulation came in, thank God, a very, very small clause was entered into it saying the money for ETS has to be spent on environmental projects, but it actually doesn't say on aviation environmental projects. Once again, I go back to Commissioner Tsikostas, who inherited this situation, and he's managed to convince the German government to put 50% of the ETS revenue back into aviation. But the other member states, and he's fighting like hell to get other member states to agree to this, he still hasn't succeeded, but he's a very, very determined person. The other member states are not following it. So the money, the billions of euros that are going into sustainability, from the passengers, is not actually going back into aviation. And I say, why is that a problem? Because the solution, the environmental solution for aviation is SAF. Now, when the EU regulation came out, it allowed the petrochemical companies, under what's called the flexibility mechanism, to produce a certain amount of SAF, but that doesn't have to be in every single airport. The flexibility mechanism in the regulation allows them to meet the 2% or 3% target, but they can put it in one airport. And in Europe today, less than 20 airports offer any significant volume of SAF. Now, why is that a problem? Because we worked on a regulation. You would think it's strange, but we said, well, okay, let's stop tankering. And we helped DG Klima to push through a regulation to stop tankering, but not taking into account that SAF would not be in every single airport. So what does this mean? It means that I, as an airline that, let's say, fly into Barcelona, can pick up SAF, and the SAF in Barcelona is not at 2%. The SAF in Barcelona may be at 10, 12%. I could have tankered that SAF to Toulouse, where there's no SAF, and I could have then flown back with the fuel with the SAF in it. Now, what does that actually mean in practice? It means that instead of lowering the fossil fuel that we're burning, this regulation has actually increased the fossil fuel that we're burning, and it was designed to lower it by maybe 1% at most. So this is where so many different regulations, if they're not synchronized, if they're not all connected, if they're not all done with some form of risk analysis, this is where the Commission is pushing through certain... I was absolutely staggered the other day. I was in the Parliament. You know that they approve 7 laws a day. There's 30,000 EU regulations. I mean, and some of these laws are hundreds and hundreds of pages long. I mean, just to understand what laws are being... I mean, I don't think any human being could possibly process what's going on. So there is a lot of work going on. There's a lot of extremely good work going on in the European Commission. But if the European Parliament don't take the advice of the Commission, we will be back to square one. And that's where we are today is very, very far from where we need to be. And I just close because I know some of you are involved in ground handling, the new ground handling directive. Well, first of all, there's a massive change. Accountable managers of airlines will not need to inspect. The authorities will now inspect in 2028 the ground operation companies in each EU airport, and this is a huge change. But said that, if now any object that hits an aircraft, including steps or the ramps that you use for baggage handling, if that hits an aircraft, The handling companies before were protected by what's called the Standard Ground Handling Agreement of IATA. And this was okay. But now that there is an EU regulation, there cannot be a limit of liability. And this is a legal issue which still has to be sorted out. So the Standard Ground Handling Agreement of IATA could actually be in some ways made redundant or unenforceable by the new regulation that comes out. And that of course will lead to increased costs, increased handling costs. And finally, just to close on one point, which I don't have a solution, but we have to agree. Our generation, when we went into the airline industry, we wouldn't think of doing anything else but being in the airline industry. We're working 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. We love what we do. We love the industry, and above all, we love what it does to humanity. It connects people in different countries that could not have possibly been connected. I'm taking seriously disabled people to Lourdes in France, and they could not have survived 24 hours or 48 hours in a train to get there, to get to Lourdes. So what is the key problem as I see it? And the panel touched on it. The quality of training needs to be dramatically improved, but above all, the education of our young people needs to be changed. Because young people absolutely think nothing of being 3 or 4 years in a job and then going and doing something else, simply because they get bored. And people of our generation, we're much, in some senses, more resilient. We stick with it. We go through crisis, we stick with it. In some senses, we're a bit, we follow a path, but we would never think about going from our industry to some other industry. But the young people today do it like this. And that's why it's with all the training in the world, it's very, very difficult. We need better education and more loyalty in a lot of the staff. And after COVID, I've noticed that there's been a massive drain, particularly in airports. There's been a massive drain in certain people and certain quality people, and a massive drain in experience after COVID. So that is a challenge that we have to face. And please, anything that can be done to help in Brussels is very welcome. Our association has airlines, but also has non-airlines. And just following what's going on in Brussels, just knowing what's going to happen in 2 years, can be of great value to a number of the support companies, whether it's handling, catering, IT, because that's a massive issue for airlines at the moment. So we really do need the help. We fortunately have people, the commissioner, at least for 5 years, which really wants to get something done, and that's fantastic. But on the other hand, we need to get particularly the Parliament to follow the experts and not necessarily just look at it from a political point of view. Any questions? Or is that totally shocked you all? Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, as you said, I have to pull out because it does not help the airlines.
No. Well, it doesn't want doesn't want obviously the costs to go up. That's the fear. But unfortunately, they've been working in a certain legal environment up until now, and now the legal environment is changing. So I mean, you need to be a lawyer to understand this really, but the enforceability of certain clauses in the SGHA of IATA is really being questioned, and that may mean that they have to come back to the table.
But for this part, exactly, Standard Ground Handling Agreement is actually done 50-50 between airline and ground handling. I was part of the Standard Ground Handling Agreement workshop, working group at that time, and there is nothing
now the new passenger rights bill will come into effect. The amount of claims and money will go dramatically up, the cost will go up, and airlines have only two things to do: charge the passengers more, which is what we're trying to avoid, or adopt what's called Article 13, which is that now, legally, the airlines will be able to recover the damages from the ground handler. And this is an interesting concept as well, because with a bird strike, if an airport hasn't put sufficient anti-bird warning systems, then the airport can now be charged. So this article, which is in there, of course airlines don't want to do that because we are partners in many respects. But either we increase, I mean, we're talking about huge increases of fares here. We're talking about fares that could well, because of this regulation, and don't get me wrong, the passenger rights in this regulation, most of them are very, very needed, very needed. The problem in this regulation is not what's in it, is what's not in the regulation. What's been dropped, the European Commission gave a whole list of things, and a lot of these things have not been incorporated. For political reasons, I guess. So that will lead to a very major increase in costs, and where we recover those costs is a different thing. Let me give you another example of how ridiculous this is. Airlines have to buy SAF. If we could buy 100% SAF, we would buy 100% SAF. There's absolute, the public think that airlines are not environmental. I've never seen companies that are more environmental than airlines. Every day they say, how can we get SAF? How can we get SAF? Now, because SAF is not present in every European airport, there is an alternative system called book and claim. And the book and claim system means that you can go and buy SAF in Palma de Mallorca and get the credit for it because Palma doesn't have SAF. Now, the book and claim system, IATA has a book and claim system. It's not the best system in the world, but it's a system that works. And now the Commission said, no, we need to have our own system. You need to wait 5 years. So for the next 5 years, what are we going to do? We have no book and claim system. And it took us 2 years as an association, by the way, us and Airlines for Europe, to push them to have a book and claim system. And now their response is, well, wait 5 years. And IATA have a system that we could adopt tomorrow. Of course, it's not a Rolls Royce, but it works. So this is where we are today and where we need to be as an industry for the benefit of the people that we are serving and the benefit of the European community, which has allowed free movement, allowed, without all these restrictions and bilateral treaties and things. This is where we have to do a lot better than we're doing today.
Okay. Okay, one last question because
Michael, it was very interesting what you said about the training and especially how to attract the young generation. And I have to say, you said airline is a very sexy industry from one side. On the other side, we have also to say that our job is so nice and we enjoy working in this industry because every day is a different day. So your work is never the same. So we are, and this is what we are trying to do at Emirates, we are trying to tell this to the young generation, saying not only inside the airline but also in the airport, in the ground handling, with the partners. We need to really give the opportunity to the young generation to understand what it means the airline ecosystem, for which maybe it's nice to be working in. Because at the end of the day, if you see in many countries in Europe, you have these people maybe going to the university, best MBAs all over the world, and then maybe they don't find a job, or maybe instead we have our industry who is lacking of very well-prepared skills. Exactly. So we should be more advertising the airline industry, saying, come and work for us.
Oh, I agree. Training, look, I'm a disability, I do a lot of training, and you cannot do enough training. And you have to do recurrent. The other thing is, you cannot just say, oh, they've been trained once and 5 years later they need to do recurrent training as well. So training is something that we need as an industry to invest in a lot more. But we also need to know a little bit that the people are going not just to leave after 1 year, because then you've invested all of that money. And pilots is different, because pilots have a huge investment to become a pilot. They have a bond, and it's a very painful process if they have to give out the bond. But this doesn't exist with remember that a lot of cabin crew are earning 800 euros a month after tax and things. So we're not training people that are earning 4,000 or 5,000 euros a month. So that this is one thing. So training.
It might be a long question. I don't know. I wondered if you could say anything to briefly put European passenger rights in a global context.
Well, personally, I think that passengers have had a very rough deal over 22 years, because the regulation that is being used was never designed for delays. So I have a huge sympathy, and there's been a huge necessity for passenger rights over the world. We also have the privilege we're not just a European association, we have the privilege of having Turkish Airlines with us, and we can learn a lot from the harmonization of different regulations. Of course, it's a cultural thing as well. We come from different cultures, and then of course you get one or two airlines that are I won't mention names, but very vocal in Europe, that obviously are not very pro-passenger rights, but we as an association are very pro-passenger rights, but it has to be a balanced approach. What is interesting is the strategy here. The strategy is to say, look, European airlines are disadvantaged. We now need to get non-European airlines, Emirates, Turkish Airlines, all of these, with Corsia, we need to get them to pay more, right? So basically, the whole industry is being burdened by extra taxes and things. The mentality isn't to say, how can we remove the costs of the European airlines so they can be more competitive with the Emirates of the situation. The airlines, the situation is to say, how can we burden Emirates, how can we burden something to sort of make a very bad situation for everybody? And that mentality has to be changed. There has to be a business logic in what the politicians are doing. And at the moment there is, of course, a logic to protect the people, and that's very good. But there has to be, I would call it a business empathy. And that has not been discussed at all. I mean, that's the disappointing thing with these new regulations. It has to be a business empathy. And when you come to see what's in America, well, of course, Americans, they don't have, I'm on the board of Eurocontrol as well, and the Europeans are over-regulated. It's a lot more complicated being a European airline than it is being an airline maybe in America. But said that, we live with what we have. We have to make the best of the world we live in. But the world we live in could be so much more improved if we had a little bit more business empathy.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Michael.